Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, and I manage the SAGE Research Methods community. Today, I'm joined by Julianne Cheek and Elise Obi, who are going to talk about a chapter from their book, Research Design. This is a part of a whole series of recordings for all the chapters in the book, so we hope you'll take a look at the entire collection. But before we get started, if you're new to our community, we're interested in all stages of research, writing about our findings and disseminating the results in all different kinds of ways. And we hope that what we offer will allow you to learn something new, whether you are new to research or an experienced researcher. So do you want to just quickly introduce yourselves before we get started?
Yes, hello, I'm Julianne Cheek. I'm a professor at the Østfold University College in Norway and one of the authors of the book.
And I am Elise Øby. I work at Christiania University College in Norway.
Okay, so we're going to assume now that we know what we want to do. We have our research questions or hypotheses, and we know who and how many we're going to need to collect the data. But we still can't start collecting the numerical data. What else do we need before we can start to do that?
Well, first of all, if you're choosing to use some form of quantitative approach, well, then you know that you need to collect data that takes the form of numbers. And this is because statistical analysis procedures, which are the tools you will use to analyze the data once you have them, they only work on numbers. So you need data to take the form of numbers. But even if the use of statistics is reasonable, as we talked about in an earlier recording covering chapter 8 of the book, your findings wouldn't be credible if the numerical data doesn't represent credible information about the variables your research focuses on. So that how to get credible information about the variables takes some work.
So in many ways, Elisa, that's the equivalent of the interview guide in qualitative research interviews that we talked about, that if we just sit and talk to people and get a whole collection of words from them, unless we've focused that talking on the specific questions that will help answer the research, it's the same thinking, but in different forms, reflecting the different understandings of research of both of quantitative and qualitative research.
Yes.
So, Elise, you were mentioning the word variables. Do you want to explain what those are and how you go about turning variables into numbers?
Well, so variables, they are the specific concepts that your research focuses on. It's something that varies among the people comprising the group that your research is designed to learn something about. And so variables could be something like age or blood pressure levels or office space where people work or the number of days some employee is absent from work due to illness or whatever. And those type of variables, it's easy to associate those type of variables to a number because your age is already in a natural way represented by a number. And the same is true for office space and the number of sick leave days. But quite often research questions or hypotheses, they're about abstract concepts. And they're not directly measurable. There's no intuitive way of associating a number to variables such as organizational commitment or turnover intention or psychological needs or behavior at work. Those type of variables, then you need to figure out a way to actually associate numbers to that type of not directly measurable variables. And that takes some work. So you need to find a way to deal with that.
So might you look at previous studies around that topic to see how they conveyed the variable in a numeric form?
Well, first of all, I think if you have this type of variable that is an abstract concept, such as organizational commitments, if we take that as our example, then you need to first you need to decide how you understand that concept. What is your theoretical understanding of the concept organizational commitment? Because that's not a given. If you read literature about organizational commitment and you read research that others have done on organizational commitment, you will discover that they have different theoretical understandings of that concept. So it's not a given. It's not just one understanding. So one of the understandings is that organizational commitment has 3 components. It would be people staying with an organization because they want to. They have some emotional attachment to that organization. The other component would be that people stay because they need to. Maybe because they don't have any other alternative, or the cost of leaving is too high. People don't want to accept the cost of leaving. And the third component would be that people stay in an organization or feel committed to an organization because they feel they ought to. And so that's the 3 component type understanding of what organizational commitment is. But it's not the only one. It could also be, if you go to literature and read what others have done on organizational commitment, you would also easily find that a different type of theoretical understanding is that organizational commitment is primarily about emotional attachment. It's people stay because they want to. And that understanding excludes the role of perceived cost and sense of obligation. So that's the first thing. You first need to define very clearly, explicitly, like write down somewhere, what is my understanding of this variable? And then once you've done that, then you can actually try to define, okay, you put up, these are the facets that will define the full scope of this variable. So that would be a list of facets. It could be 1, it could be 3, depends on your theoretical understanding. And then you are ready to start to develop measurement items. So items, they could be questions, or they could be statements in questionnaires, for example, that are designed to capture each facet of the variable. And so then you need your set of measurement items, which makes up your complete questionnaire, that needs to reflect both the theoretical underpinnings of your variable. It needs to tap into all the facets that you have decided reflects your understanding of the variable. And the measurements also need to be reliable and valid. So reliability ensures that the measurements are consistent over time and across respondents, because if the measurements are not consistent across respondents and over time, then you don't get comparable data. And you need comparable data in order for the statistical analysis procedures to actually give you some trustworthy findings. And validity of the measurements, that's what confirms that you are measuring what you intend to measure. Because when you measure something abstract, an abstract concept, by asking people to respond to measurement items like questions or statements, then you actually need a way to be sure that you're actually measuring what you intend to measure. And that's not a given either.
Well, Lisa, I'm thinking that that's a really good illustration of, in the previous podcast, we were talking about qualitative analysis as predominantly inductive, where we would be working up those categories, like we would be investigating what organizational commitment is, and we would be looking for all the different dimensions that make it up. Whereas in quantitative approaches, it is far more deductive, in that what you are actually looking at is areas of organizational commitment that we or you as researcher have identified as important for a
Yes.
specific reason, that they are important in terms of a specific question. And it is those aspects or those variables of that concept that you are going to deduce things about, you are going to work deductively about. And that's why you have to be very precise in your definition of them. Whereas if you went into a qualitative study about organizational commitment and you said, I'm going to study effective commitment, continuance, and normative commitment, for example, things like that, I would say that's a rather limited, not as rich as it could be qualitative study, because like you're saying, there might be other facets we haven't even thought of, and there might be many ways of thinking about it. But I was just thinking that might help listeners with that deductive, inductive sort of idea.
Yes, I agree. That's a good example.
So what do we do when our quantitative research involves variables that are not directly measurable?
Well, then you decide or you decide on a theoretical understanding, so that you decide upfront, this is my theoretical understanding. These are the facets or dimensions that make up this variable, and these are the ones I'm going to measure. Then you start to develop specific measurement items, and you need to be sure that they are actually measuring what you intend to measure. And that, of course, you want them to measure what they intend to measure, but that's not so easy, because, you know, it could be that your idea of what you ask about in a specific question is clear to you, and then it's not clear to the people that you want to respond. For example, like if you ask people to assess the performance of the criminal justice system in their country, and there are more than one problem here, but one apparent problem is that people might have different understandings of what is meant by the criminal justice system. So if you ask people to assess the performance of the criminal justice system, then some respondents might think that criminal justice system is the police, the courts, and the prisons. And others might think that the criminal justice system is it's synonymous to the courts only. So if people have different understandings or different interpretations of what the measurement item is really about, then the responses are non-comparable, because you don't know which understanding they base their response on. So then you have two pieces of data, but they're not comparable. That would be like comparing apples to bananas. So that doesn't work very well. So what you actually need to put in work on is to develop measurement items that capture the full scope, like tap into all the facets that you have decided, or all the dimensions that you have decided to comprise your understanding of the variables. And so you needed to reflect the specific theoretical underpinnings of that variable, and you needed to produce data that is comparable across the group of respondents. And those things, that's the craft in its own right. It's not easy. It's not a one-step process. It takes continuous refinements. You need to test these items multiple times before you can actually conclude that this measurement instrument that takes the form of a questionnaire actually works the way it's supposed to do. It measures what it's supposed to measure, and it works as you need it to work. And that's the craft of its own, and it blends scientific rigor and actually the understanding human behavior and how people respond to questions. You need to know a bit about that too to develop these good measurement items. So we talked about collaboration among researchers, and here this is an area where you need to team up with the researchers that are not, they're not experts in statistics. They are more experts in how do people react when they are faced with a question they're supposed to answer.
So you may have already answered this, but can you discuss a measurement item for which it is not clear what is being measured?
So one is like, okay, someone asked me, please assess the performance of the criminal justice system in your country. Then I put my interpretation of what the criminal justice system is in that response. So if that's not clear, and if all respondents doesn't have the same understanding of what the criminal justice system is, then our responses would be non-comparable. And also, like, if someone asked me, how much time do you spend on social media platforms? Well, then I don't know what they mean spending time on a social media platform. Does it mean that I'm active, like liking stuff and scrolling and looking at things? Or is it just being logged on? Am I then spending time on social media platforms? So I put my interpretation of the question in my response. So you need to like phrase these questions or statements so that you, as much as possible, take away these individual interpretations so that you actually make the data produced by your measurement instrument comparable across all respondents.
So would you include that kind of clarification and that kind of precision to make sure that, you know, that say everyone answering the question about how much time do you spend on social media is answering the same question, you know, or perhaps the larger kind of definitions? Might some of that occur even as a part of the informed consent stage of defining the study clearly for participants if you're doing something like a survey study?
It could, or you could just rephrase the question. If what you want to know is how much time people spend being actually active, interacting with the content on social media platform, then ask them to estimate how much time do you spend every day liking or interacting with the content on that specific social media platform, instead of asking them how much time do you spend on social media platform. Just try to be, the general advice is being as specific as possible in each question.
But I think Janet also had a point, maybe even a word like social media, Elisa. Like,
yes.
We take it for granted that everybody has the same understanding of what social media is, and we may or may not. So, you know, it may be that you have to put in the parameters of that in your consent form or at the start that, you know, when we refer to social media, this is what we are referring to.
Yes, I agree.
Or specify different types of social media where the researcher identifies the types. So it's even words like that that seem so obvious, ordinary, taken for granted daily terms that can get people into enormous trouble in quantified questionnaires, because at the end, as you say, you've got a whole lot of nothing. You've got a lot of numbers, nice statistics, but not many interpretations that you can make.
I think these points, I hope for our viewers can really think about this, because one of the reasons why you know, someone might use a type of research like a questionnaire or a survey is that you can reach a lot of people all over the place. You don't have to have someone that you can meet with one-to-one. You can, and we have, even if I were doing research within my own community, there are all kinds of people who have different backgrounds, come from different languages, and the terminology is not the same. When I work with people who are, say, in a similar professional discipline from the United States and the UK, for example, I mean, here we might say dissertation as a doctoral product. In the UK, it would be called the thesis at the doctoral level. So, making sure that you understand, how those terms might be interpreted in different settings, would seem like important for a questionnaire, and in some ways even more important in a questionnaire or a survey, because if you were in an interview, you could, if the person is, tell me what you mean, you could explain it. But, if you're giving someone an electronic or some other kind of a instrument, you're not there to try to explain it. So that precision is even more important, it would seem to me.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And that would also, you need to think about, like, what are you requiring from people that you want to respond? Because there could be questions that requires people to remember things. And like, if I ask you, Janet, how many broccolis do you buy over the course of a year? Could you give me, like an answer that would be sort of true? Or then I'm just guessing
Yes.
that you would have to think about that for a while. And then maybe you feel like you didn't sign up for doing some calculation and estimating stuff. So then maybe you just, okay, I don't care about this. I'm just ticking some random box and then I'm done with the questionnaire. And then the data I get from you, it wouldn't help me at all, because I don't know if what you have responded actually reflects your true opinion or your broccoli shopping behavior, right?
Well, that's a good lead into the next question, about how human behavior and responses affect the measurement of variables in quantitative research.
One of the most important things to remember here, I think, is that people tend to gloss over our shortcomings. And so, we tend to underreport behavior that we know is not socially desirable. So if you're asked, like, how many times have you accepted cash in hand payments, or how many times have you, okay, so how many hours a day or how many minutes a day do you spend helping your kids with their homework? Then you would tend to answer what you think is acceptable. So you say, they would normally say that, oh, I help my kids with the homework. Yes, I do. I always do. But that might not be the full and honest truth. So that's called social desirability. And that's something, if you ask people and you want their, like, genuine behaviors and opinions, then you need to think about how you're phrasing the question, so you don't make people like feel uneasy, or you want them to actually give you their opinions and their behaviors and not feel uneasy about doing so.
Right.
And that's one of the things about that objectivity and subjectivity that we talk about in the book as well, in that, we have people telling us that quantitative research is an objective form of research, and that's its great strength. But what we forget is that if we're not careful, it's people that are answering these questions, and people are subjective in the way that they will answer the questions. All right. And whether or not, we will never have a way of knowing unless we actually followed up and asked them or observed them or whatever, whether or not what they answered was true. What we get is the best, closest, but never the absolute objective answer, which is that positivistic ontological position from podcast 4 of, verifiable facts that exist outside of people. In social science, it's impossible to have any sort of fact that doesn't involve somebody in some way. All you can do is minimize the subjectivity in quantitative research. In qualitative research, we want to get at those perceptions and experiences. And often that's helpful when designing questionnaires as well. Can be very helpful to do some interviews and things like that as a precursor to developing the items in a questionnaire.
Yes.
So are there other things to think about besides the development of the measurement instrument itself?
Well, at least there are two things. If you want to adopt an existing measurement instrument, because there are existing measurement instruments out there that have been developed by others, that have been tested, that have been fine-tuned so that they know that they work the way it's supposed to. And any researcher can adopt one of those, and then you don't have to develop your own. But then you need to remember that then you also adopt the theoretical understanding of the variables being measured in that instrument. So if you have chosen some theoretical understanding and decided on these are the dimensions that is relevant and that I focus on related to this variable, then you need to know that the measurement instrument you adopt from somewhere else reflects that same understanding, or else you're not measuring what you are claiming to be measuring. And the other thing is that the way you approach people when you actually put that measurement instrument into practice, you actually distribute that instrument to people that you want to respond, and the way you approach them might actually affect the data that you get. Because there are different ways of putting questionnaires into practice. You could do face-to-face interviews, or you could do telephone interviews, or you could send paper questionnaires to be filled out and then returned, or the very usual way nowadays is to distribute electronic questionnaires by email, and then respondents fill out and then submit. And then, so if you want data from a group of people that might not have regular access to a computer or the knowledge to use one, then choosing to approach them by distributing your questionnaire by email, that might not be the best way. And then also, if you have sensitive questions, like questions about political preference or abuse, something like that, then maybe face-to-face interviews or even telephone interviews might make people not willing to answer your questions. So you need to think about how will your questions meet the people that you want to respond to them, and take that into account. And I think those two are important things to consider when you actually decide how will I actually go about to put this measurement instrument out in the real world, meeting the people that I want to respond to my questions.
Right. But I think that those of us who are connected all the time assume that everyone is, but that's
not true.
the case.
No.
The digital divide still exists, and then there are people who just would have a preference not to enter data online. So
yes,
thinking through those as it relates to your sample would be important thought process to go through.
So really that puts another focus on piloting, doesn't it? Like we pilot our stuff. One of the things we should be thinking when we're piloting questionnaires and that is piloting it with people from the target group.
Yes.
Especially if it's aimed at a specific cultural group or whatsoever. How are these questions? Is the nuance correct? Is the terminology correct? Have we inadvertently been disrespectful or whatever else? These are the nuances we need to pick up, even in quantitative surveys. And we forget that. We do this sort of work a lot when we're developing our questions in qualitative, but in quantitative it's the same. And so, you know, if you pilot with older people and you give them the digital questionnaire, you'll probably get the feedback fairly rapidly. Look, I can do this, but I don't necessarily feel comfortable with it being digital. Or you might get, I like it being digital. So you might choose to let people in that age group decide which one they want to answer, which format. You might use different formats. I think that we're not up with some of the changes in the context that people exist with, and how that might affect how we need to pilot and develop both qualitative and quantitative ways of collecting our information.
So the last question for this chapter, what happens when you don't get the data you need? So you've done all of the steps and considerations we've discussed, but you still don't get the data that you need. Then what do you do?
Well, okay, so you have done everything right. Okay, so you have the perfect sampling strategy. You have followed all the rules from probability. You know that you have a really good questionnaire and a perfect plan for analyzing the data. And then you're in the situation where you don't get enough data, or people just don't want to respond. So then what do you do? Because remember that you use a sample. So you decide on a subgroup from the larger population, and you distribute your questionnaire to them. And then from whatever you learn about them should be generalizable to the broader population. And then to achieve that, the sample must be at least approximately representative for the larger population. But if the sample becomes too small, like if your number of respondents become too few, then it cannot be representative, because it's simply too small. And then what do you do? Because then your sample all of a sudden doesn't enable generalizability, which is the overall goal. And then I think this happens quite often. So if you're in that situation, well, know that this happens quite often. And I think that if you are in that situation, I think it's just remember that no matter how you do your research and which approach you use, you will always have to deal with trade-offs between what's ideal and what's feasible. And I think that you can get valuable insights and knowledge despite having to prioritize feasibility over the ideal. And then I think that you just need to know what you're doing. You need to know what happened, and you need to know when you have accepted some form of trade-off, and you need to know the effect of that trade-off. And if you are aware of that, if you can come clean about that, then I believe that we can learn something from samples that are not ideal and not exactly what we planned for, as long as the research is carefully carried out. I think that's the important thing. And if you can come clean about the trade-offs you have accepted, then, well, this is what you were able to do. And that could give us some valuable insights too.
Right, and it also might give you a good foundation from which to build your next research. So,
yes,
you know, there may be things where you say, well, you know, I achieved 2 out of 3 of the things I was hoping to get from this study. Well, maybe now I need to design a different approach to get the, you know, the other kinds of answers that we want. So I think, thank you for explaining these. And I think it's important for our viewers to see that, you know, at least in, you know, many kinds of quantitative research, there are just as many kind of human factors to consider as with qualitative. I often encounter people who think, well, quantitative means like you don't have to deal with those pesky humans, but in fact, you probably do. And even if you were going to use data that in an established data set or data collected from someone else, I hope that the questions and ideas that we've suggested here would help you to evaluate whether the quality of that, the research that generated that data would meet your standards. Is there anything else that you would like to add from Chapter 9?
No, I think we have covered the most important stuff, and we have also compared a bit to the thinking that underlies qualitative approaches. So then I think, no, I'm done.
Okay, well, thank you very much.